we're going to be looking at in this video is going to be looking at all the tips, tricks, and techniques in order to achieve essay success and to help your writing no end in being able to write an essay quickly, be able to have all the skills that you need ready for whenever you need to write one, but also just a very simple guideline to the kinds of things that you need to do in order to write a really, really good essay. Okay, so let's start. So in this video, we'll go through some very simple strategies. Not so much going into in depth, but looking at just a very simple thing and a very simple checklist that you can have at the top of your head. Whenever you go into writing an essay, you have them at the top of your mind and you know what you're going to be doing when it comes to actually writing it. So basically, this is to overcome the main hurdles, which is essentially the mental process. And often, at least I find when I'm teaching them, is the hardest part for a lot of you would be to just simply get through the mental process of actually writing it. So we'll go through a lot of that today as well. Now, simple is probably the best approach. And the reason for that is if you keep a clear head and a clear mind and you don't try and overcomplicate things, you don't try and write the world's best essay every time, then you find yourself being able to focus on really doing the most important things right, getting an answer to the question done, getting a good approach in, getting a very good and clear structure. Having all those things is a lot more important than really trying to blow the pants off any marker or anyone else who are trying to mark your work. If you keep it nice and simple, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to then build up and make your arguments and ideas more sophisticated as you go. The other technique is also, or tip should I say, is that you don't really need to be a master linguist to get a high band 6. And I want to dispel that myth, right? You don't have to have a really high vocabulary in order to get a really high mark. What you need is to be able to develop a very sophisticated argument. Now, those two things are quite different. While, yes, to get a sophisticated argument, you will require more than just your very basic run-of-the-mill vocabulary. At the same time, you shouldn't be trying to impress people with the kinds of language that you use. There is no criteria for impressive language. There's no outcome for it. So to come up with arguments or things which are really, really complex and deep and isn't going to give you any extra marks than one that is clear, concise, and sophisticated. So it's something to bear in mind. The first step is to have a plan. Now, this is probably the most important thing that any teacher will tell you about essay writing, is to have a plan. This is not something that is a plan which requires you to go massively into detail. It's one you keep very simple. It's one that you should be able to hone and reuse over and over again. In other words, a plan which you can go back to every single time. Not only does it help to keep your writing consistent, but also helps you when you get feedback. Because what you use that feedback for is to go back to your plan and work out how you fix the plan without having to sort of try and work on little tiny things over and over again, and to do that every time you write an essay. If your plan was correct and you just had a bad day, then you know you don't have to really fix, it's not the plan that was the problem, it's just the fact that you had a bad day when you wrote it. And everyone does. Everyone, when they write something or they write a response, they do have good days and bad days. To be able to reuse a plan and have it over and over, and one you can stick solid with, means that you can focus on things that you're doing wrong as a whole, rather than necessarily fixing up little tiny itty bitty things all over the place and all the time. It helps you to also structure and organize your ideas in a much, much simpler way. A structure is also one way you'll earn most of your marks. Now, what I mean by that is by having a structured answer, and this is what I mean by a sophisticated answer, is one that is structured to such an extent, not only is it readable, you're getting your argument across the most effective way you can. In terms of actually writing, it is your structure that's probably going to get you the most. And not just necessarily paragraph structure, but just structure in terms of how you set out your argument. The basic principles for setting out an argument is just to make it logical and make it clear. In other words, to make sure it makes sense, and to make sure that it's very, very clear that it makes sense. Two very simple principles, I'm sure, ones that you really need to stick to, particularly when talking about sophisticated ideas and sophisticated topics. Okay, so you need to develop very clear ideas. Now, what I mean by clear ideas is just to have ones that are very, very concise and are much easier to explain than really overly complex ones. Now, you can get more complex with your ideas, but the thing is, your base idea, or the thing you come up with to start with, the thing that should be on your topic sentences, should be nice and clear and simple. And then you build on it with sophisticated points and arguments. It's through your discussion that you expand upon these ideas. This is what I mean by developing that sophistication. So you keep a nice clear topic sentence, and then you expand on it into really deeper and much more meaningful sorts of ideas. To have the clear idea to start with means that you don't have to spend your time explaining your idea. What you're doing is you have a clear idea and then you're developing it, you're analyzing it critically. You are expanding on it with higher order concepts and thoughts. So you're really going into the abstract ideas, the deep ideas, the meaning, the ideas which relate to the text and its context and its importance. All those ideas will come through your expansion and not through the ideas themselves. So rather than try and get them around the wrong way and have really complex ideas and simple explanations, try to have the simple idea first, and then you can back it up with a more complex and more developed explanation. Immediately when I'm reading it, you have to think in terms of a marker here. When I'm reading it, I know that this complex explanation is matching this very simple definition you've given me, and I understand that. So it makes it much easier for me to interpret your argument, to find the sophisticated points that you developed, and be able to mark it that way. Having obscure or poorly defined ideas make it very difficult for a marker such as myself to be able to interpret your essay, what your answer is trying to indicate. So if you have a really complex answer, I don't know if you're trying to answer the question or not. What you should be trying to do is find something that's very, very simple for a marker to get, and then you can just develop it a little bit more after that. So we have that sort of thing in our minds when we're marking, which we can then go back to over and over again. The next thing is to try and incorporate your evidence in your discussion. You're making it clear that your evidence is proving your point. Now, to just go through very quickly what that means. Instead of just using a quote, you need to justify why it's there. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, if I was to back up something with evidence and to use a quote, that's not supporting it. That's just giving me a quote. You need to make sure your quotes are directed towards what you're discussing, what your question is asking, and what you're trying to prove in your essay response. If you have a quote, what you need to try and do is work it into your discussion. Now, the other thing you can do, if you're not using a quote, if you're just paraphrasing it, or if you're using a detail or a language technique from the text, the one thing you can do is you can work that evidence, so that language technique or that sample of paraphrased text, into your discussion. And what that does is it sort of integrates the two together. So you're using your evidence to support your discussion and your discussion to support your evidence. It's sort of an interrelated concept. By putting those two things together, it means that the two won't stand apart from each other. So if you have discussion which is not really proving anything, then it's worthless. If you have evidence that's not really proving any discussion, again, it's also worthless. You put the two together, they have a lot more meaning. So that's what you should be trying to do, is putting the two things together. All right, next point is depth, and depth is key. There is a difference between a complex argument and a deep one. A complex one is one that you have to explain as you go, whereas a deep one really goes into the core ideas and values. Developing a complex argument is quite tricky, and that's what I mean by the use of language and the use of ideas. If you come up with really complex ones, it can be tricky, and often it is needlessly tricky. By doing that, all it's going to end up doing is you're going to confuse people. What you need to be trying to do is come up with some deeper points rather than necessarily trying to make them more complex. Now, a deep argument is one that covers ideas in detail. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're covering ideas in such a way where you're going into really obscure parts of the story. What that means is you cover ideas which cover a lot of the story, or really broad, far-ranging ideas which are really quite well represented in the text you're studying or that you're responding to, or in terms of the ideas that you're responding to. A deep argument goes beyond just finding examples or finding reasons. It goes into the core of and the heart of what it is a text is doing and what you're really attempting to prove in your answer. So if you have an answer that you can prove with one or two explanations but doesn't really go into why or how, you're not going deep enough. If you're going deep, you're finding things that you can use to support large sections of it. It's like a pie and you're trying to cover it all, and like an ocean and you're trying to fill it as much as you can. You should be able to explain it comprehensively and without doubt why your interpretation is correct as well, which means that it should be able to stand up. By making your argument deep and by making it cover larger sections of the text and being deep, you're allowing it to independently even stand up and say that because this is covering so much of the text, there's no reason why this is not a strong and valid point. And that's what you're trying to prove. If you're saying, why do young people do bad things, and you're saying because of drugs, well, that's only affecting a very, very small portion of young people. There are a lot of other much broader issues which you can go much deeper into, which lead to teenagers taking drugs or young people taking drugs. It may develop your discussion a lot further than just simply saying, oh, it's drugs. Everyone's on drugs. No, that's not really quite true. The same thing when you're developing your arguments. If you find the things that are leading to all these things happening, the heart of the story or the text that you're looking at, then you've got a much deeper argument. Next point is grouping your small ideas into large ones. So think of it like a rubber band ball, which is that you have lots of little things there which you've just sort of put together and becomes this one big thing. So you can develop them into two big ones rather than lots of like 8 or 9 small ones, because what you have with 8 or 9 small ones is A, it means you're not repeating yourself, and B, you're essentially being able to develop it. It's required to develop some depth in your argument, which is needed really for a strong essay. The other thing is, while a lot of small points may cover a wider area, they won't cover it in a deep sort of way. You can cover a lot of the surface. Unless you're really going into the heart of it, you're not really going into it. It's not going to really prove it's true. You're just going to have lots and lots of reasons. Having lots of reasons is all well and good, but the thing is you need to actually explain them and properly prove them. If you have lots of reasons and they're not really proven, you could challenge those ideas, then it's not an effective response. It's not really answering a question. It's just giving lots of reasons, which could form an answer if you had a lot more time and a lot more space. Now, the last technique is called review and not edit. Editing an essay is fixing things, whereas reviewing means you're being critical of your own work. So you're looking back and you're going, okay, how can I make this better? What you should be focusing on is making improvements. How can I make my work better? And it's something that virtually everyone that should be trying to do when they write is trying to do something better next time. So trying to make improvements. After all, it's how you learn, is by making mistakes, learning from them, and trying to improve for next time. And also by reflecting on your work and realizing, okay, what can I do better? What was I marked down on? What can I do better next time? By doing that before even your work is marked and go, okay, how can I get it up to a higher standard? You're giving yourself an opportunity to push yourself further for extra marks without having necessarily get feedback first. This can also help if your ideas are unclear or even if your sentences are unclear. So if you read it back and go, hang on, what does that mean? And you take a fresh look at it. So you write whatever response it is, you take a 5-minute break. If it's in an exam, you just take a minute to look at another section and come back to it. If you're doing something at home, then you go off, watch TV for half an hour, a day even, if you've prepared well enough, and then go back and go, okay, can I understand this? Does it make sense to me? Yes, okay, it does mean that you don't do things the night before or last minute or rush them through, but one thing it does allow you to do is to make sure that you can correct very simple mistakes and also make sure that things that you write are completely clear. Anyone can understand them. You can understand them, which is obviously the most important thing, because if you can't understand them, there's no hope for us. Making sure that you go back and just go, okay, it makes sense. I know it makes sense. I understand what it is I'm trying to do. I'm making sure it goes back to the answer. Okay, everything's done. I can now go off, blood, relax, do something else. And that's basically all there is to it. So really, that's your crash course on everything that you need to be able to do in order to achieve a successful essay. So until next time I see you, I'll see you later.